Odell Beckham Jr. a sighting. He was spotted this week in Phoenix, game 2 of the Suns-Mavs series. He's looking like he's having a good time. We know he's a new dad. We've also seen Odell at the top of the available free agents list over at NFL.com, and he joined the Rams mid-season, of course, last year, and they needed him. He turned it on in the playoffs. Woods gets injured. He did get injured, of course. Odell did at the end of the first half in the Super Bowl. That was huge, but he still emerged a champion, and he is still unsigned. So now that the draft is settled, teams basically know where they're at with wide receivers. This draft was huge, so much depth, and they all went off the board. So who's there left to sign Odell Beckham Jr.?
I think the Rams should re-sign him.
Really?
And I think it should have happened already. Odell Beckham was a huge part of this Rams Super Bowl team and was a beloved teammate. I could tell you that when he came in, there were a lot of doubters on the outside, and those first few weeks were not as smooth as they could have been. And yet, Odell, the player and the person, was incredible. Sean McVay speaks openly about it, that Odell took that team to the next level, and when they needed him most, he was there. You go to that Baltimore game in the rain, that LA was still fighting for an NFC West title against Arizona and San Francisco, and Odell Beckham was the story, made huge plays left and right. Cooper Kupp was covered, was draped all over him, and Odell was the one making big fourth down conversions and then the touchdown score in the end. I think that was just setting the table for the playoffs, where you get to the NFC Championship game against San Francisco. Again, Cooper Kupp would have massive plays against the Buccaneers the week before, but it was Odell who was putting his body on the line and making enormous plays in clutch moments for San Francisco. And then one of the great what-ifs of Super Bowl history is what ifs Odell didn't tear his knee up in the Super Bowl, because he started that game, those first 2 quarters, and he was unstoppable. The Bengals' strategy was, let's just drape ourselves all over Cooper Kupp and let's let Odell beat us. McVay's strategy was, let's make Odell our number 1 and let's pick on who's ever covering Odell because we got him. He was on pace to have 250 yards in this game. Odell, there is a Super Bowl ring that he has gotten, but there is also this feeling of like, this was the perfect home for Odell Beckham. He loves LA, they love him. I don't know what else you could be looking for. It almost makes too much sense. And the way that they've built this thing, with Allen Robinson now coming, we don't need to rush Odell. Odell, come whenever you're ready. Show up in November if you need. Show up in December if you need. We need you for those clutch moments, just like we had last year. Odell Beckham was a great Los Angeles Ram, even if it was for a small window. Let's bring it back and let's see if we can get some more.
Why isn't he signed yet then?
I don't know.
Is there concern, not with the Rams, but league-wide about the injury?
I think anyone coming off as serious an injury as is, and Tom, you can weigh in too, that there's going to be a concern about it. But I believe the Rams would be willing to sign Odell if the number was right for him today. That's how much their interest was strong on Odell.
It is a borderline miracle that Odell did what he did down the stretch last season with the Rams and in the Super Bowl, because his knee was so bad.
Dangling.
That ACL was going to tear eventually. So everyone says, oh, Odell misses out on this big payday. He may not have been able to pass a team's physical and sign a free agent contract. So at this point, he's not going to be ready until around Thanksgiving. Okay. So that's part of the factor here. But in terms of like his overall recovery and his ability to move forward from here, it might be the best thing that possibly happened was having the ACL.
That's going to affect the price then. So maybe he's a value for a team. He's going to have to be agreeable to that. And it's a team that's contending that might need him a little later, one that can stand being patient with him out the gates. I think it's the Ravens. Rams, you had your time, you got your championship ring. I want Lamar Jackson to win a Super Bowl. They just got rid of Hollywood Brown. They need a speedy guy, and that can be Odell. Maybe not right away. And I know they have Rashad Bateman, who I love, Triggs. You know how much I love him, how disappointing it was to not see him do his thing out there. But that is your complete all-around great wide receiver. They need a speedy guy, a guy who can help take the top off the defense a little bit. And if they can have that element to make a Super Bowl push, which is what I expect from this Ravens team, that's where I'd like to see Odell go, with that mentality, with Lamar Jackson throwing him the ball. And we've seen it, since Lamar took over. They can get into the playoffs. We've seen this over and over. Yes, run. Use your run game. We get it. But once you get in there, and we're talking about the Bengals, and we're talking about the Bills, the run game simply isn't enough, and neither is the defense. You have to have some sort of threat in the passing game, and that is Odell. And if he had stayed healthy, they would have smoked the Bengals probably, because it was an incredible performance. And it's wild that they won without him in the second half.
Both of you make very good, logical
cases
for where he lands. But this is Odell Beckham Jr. we're talking about. It's an unusual situation because he's not going to have real live reps for a good chunk of the offseason. Right. He's got to go someplace where ideally he has some type of foundation in the offense. How about the Miami Dolphins? Now, they've traded for Tyreek Hill, okay? They obviously have Jalen Waddle, who's been a high-volume player, but they are going speed, speed, speed. They signed Cedric Wilson, too. They signed Trent Sherfield. But if you're talking about hedging your bets and insurance policy, if something happens to one of those guys, there's not a whole lot of people better than Odell Beckham Jr. to be able to step in and give you something. I don't think this is likely.
This would be so
To be clear,
scary.
before this goes viral and we tweet that thing out, I'm not saying Odell is going to the Dolphins.
Tom Pelissero reporting. Yeah.
Mike McDaniel runs a similar type of an offense, or is going to what Sean McVay runs. Odell could basically do the same thing, just be on the backside, win one-on-ones. It's not overly complicated. Come in when you're ready down the stretch for a team that you never know in this league. Injuries happen. Different things happen through the course of a season. Maybe that's the function he plays somewhere, Torrey.
Yeah, I love that. That's a bold take that Tom definitely said he's going to Miami, everyone, by the way. I want to clarify that. Okay. No, but I think for Odell, it boils down to really what he wants and what he needs and what that particular match is. And so for me, it's a team that has the opportunity to compete and win, and a team that's going to be great on the back end, and that's the Green Bay Packers. Their wide receiver room right now, they have a couple veterans in there. You have Alan Lazard, you have Sammy Watkins, right? But to me, you're not getting Odell to help you get to that point. You're getting him at that point to help you get over the hump. And that's really the biggest difference. Adding that playmaker now, Odell's a guy that's been there. He's not just a guy that you're adding a vet that can play, no, he has that Super Bowl experience. I know what it's like personally to have that experience, to help spread that and explain to other guys what it takes to play at that level. But he's also a guy that's proven that he can take his game up a notch. And by the way, Aaron Rodgers, we know he's going to be good enough to get the Packers to the NFC Championship game again. We know that. That's just a given. But with Odell Beckham, I think he can be that missing piece that can get them over the hump.
I love that. I want them to have a veteran. I've been screaming from the rooftops about that. Quickly, before we even move on here, it is very hard. Peter, you can speak to this because you cover this league day in, day out with me here on the show, like leading the charge. It's very hard to change how you're seen as a player, as a coach, as an offense, as a team, what your identity is as a team, or you run it. It's so hard to change the narrative on you. And there's not been a time, I don't think, where we would have been talking about Odell, Miami, without it being like, well, Miami's a party town. Like, can he handle Miami? And not one of us said it. Not one of us was going to say it. So whatever Odell's done, whether it's a change of scenery, Sean McVay's credit to all of that, there's always talk about Odell in the locker room. There's always talk about how is he going to fit in the scene? Is he going to prioritize football? That is not the case anymore, and I just think that should be pointed out.
It's a great point, Kay. And, when you go to the NFC Championship game and he's the one consoling Deebo Samuel as the veteran and saying, hey, don't worry. And then you go to the Super Bowl, and after he tears up his knee, it's him and it's his lady and it's his mother, and they're on the field, and you're like, oh, Odell's more than Met Gala and going out and partying, in Vegas. Like, Odell actually is a fully evolved man who's been through so much. Mm-hmm. And always the flip side is going to be, yeah, but look at what the video is with Baker, and look how it ended with the Giants. Look, Odell has had a bunch of things that have happened in his career, but I don't think anyone questions the man and the leader that he can be.
They used to, though, but now they don't.
Why, though? Odell's always been that guy. Anyone that knows Odell Beckham, anyone that's ever been around him knows that what the media has done and said is not who he's ever been as a person. People, just because he made that big-time catch here where we're in New York where we are, people took it and talked about him in a different way. Odell the person has never been a problem. Odell the teammate has never been a problem. Odell just breathes.
Baker and all that was something.
But Baker, I mean, maybe he's upset, but even within that locker room, he wasn't a person that was driving and calling them out and doing them things. Dad had to do what he had to do to get him up out of there, right? But he was never actively doing anything. You will never find a teammate that said Odell Beckham was a horrible teammate, period. However, that hasn't been the narrative because of people from the outside, and I'm glad that it's been able to be controlled somewhat because people that know him, and I've been around him a bunch, it's been frustrating to see that because he is a superstar kind of player, but he's consistently been a good dude, and I feel like he's got the short end of the stick from the media.
There were a lot of things earlier in his career attacking the kicking net, later proposing
The
to the
punch.
kicking net, the screaming in the hallway,
Yeah.
the punch, various altercations with players on the field. I mean, there were a bunch of things where it was just, this is a guy who's learning to manage his emotions, and he had a lot to figure out. And you're in the biggest media spotlight ever because of the catch, as you mentioned. One of the key parts of the dynamic in L.A., he didn't need to be the guy. He didn't need to be the leader because you had other veteran players, strong personalities. He didn't even need to be the guy in the receiver room. And that's one thing I heard was everybody had that question about how's he going to fit in. And obviously the situation, Robert Woods gets injured and he ends up having a bigger role. But like, he knew it was Cooper Kupp's room. He let him be the leader. He let him be the guy. Didn't complain about how much he was getting the football. He fit in with a team, which is what his next team, if it's not the Rams, is going to be asking him to do.
But also what we see about the elite of elite wide receivers, not a lot of them are like Cooper Kupp, who work in silence and let you know. Cooper Kupp, the way I think I think he deserves some credit for how that wide receiver, not just about Odell, but in general, it's not a me guy. It's not a guy who wants the targets. And if it was, I can name 7 other wide receivers that were in that room. I don't know if it would work.
And the story goes that Jalen Ramsey brought the FaceTime into the wide receivers room and says, hey, do you guys want Odell? And Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods were like, Odell, you got to come. You got to come. To your point, that might not be with every #1 wide receiver.
Do you disagree, Tori?
I don't know.
Do you disagree with that?
Sounds like Mike Evans to me, man.
Yeah.
Superstars that can handle it. Guys that just want to win. If you want to win, it truly shows.